Well, good morning. This is Barry Jones of Standards Plus History Academy. And yesterday we were dealing with the evidence that was incriminating, presented first by the FBI to the Warren Commission. And looked pretty convincing. It's pretty slam dunk test evidence. You're talking about the fact that they have determined that the bullets and all the bullet fragments that were found in the limo, that were found in Dealey Plaza, that were found in Governor Connolly's wrist, that were found in the president's brain, the bullet that was found at Parkland Hospital were all fired from the Mannlicher Carcano. They're also stating that the 4 shell casings from Officer Tippett's gun scene came from the 38 that they found on Oswald. And they were able to produce evidence that the magic bullet was shot from the Texas Schoolbook Depository. They found 3 shell casings at the Texas Schoolbook Depository. They said were fired from the Mannlicher Carcano. Then they were able to establish that the Mannlicher Carcano and the 38 belonged to Lee Harvey Oswald. They showed receipts, order slips, receipts of delivery at the post office, and a backyard photo. And just the evidence along the ballistics shows that it was Oswald's guns who killed those 2 people, the president and the Dallas police officer, that they were his guns and that the fatal shot was fired from the Texas Schoolbook Depository. And so it looks like an open and shut case, but this is why you get to present a defense, because it's not quite as open and shut as you might think. Some of the other evidence that we presented yesterday that was presented to the Warren Commission, the evidence that he was in the Texas Schoolbook Depository seconds after the shooting, really is an easy counter. There's an easy defense for that. But anyway, that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at some of the evidence that contradicts this cover story, that perhaps is exculpatory, or perhaps at least casts a little doubt. And of course, in a criminal trial, it's got to be a unanimous verdict. Any shadow of doubt, you can't convict somebody if it's not beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's what we're going to look at today. And I think more of it's more than just a little bit of doubt. I think that's what you're going to see when we go through this evidence. These 2 photos, kind of interesting. Warren Commission is going to state from the beginning that all the shots came from one person, thus they have to come from one location. And I've got 2 pictures here of the grassy knoll that are taken from in the direction of the grassy knoll. So you can kind of see in this first picture on top, there's a little red circle, top middle of the picture, which is where a lot of JFK researchers think the fatal shot came from. You see how close it is, and you can see the clear field there. Somebody commented yesterday, and I hadn't thought about this, but the assassination teams that were placed in different places in Dealey Plaza, it was well planned. And I've gone back and I've kind of looked, and they're right, especially the team that is low on the ground. You notice they take the shot has just happened. The fatal shot has just happened. Kennedy is falling back into the arms of Jackie. And you can see the shooter has a clear field. If that's the shooter, if that's the location of the shooter, he has a completely clear field in front of him so as not to hit any spectators or cause any other damage to any other human being. You've got a clear field. Of course, if you're up high, it doesn't really matter, but I hadn't noticed that before. The picture here at the top shows the motorcycles behind the motorcade behind the limo, and the one motorcycle, which is a little bit obscure, it looks like there's a fingerprint on the picture, but you can see past the fingerprint there is a motorcycle cop there, and that's the motorcycle that was sprayed with the head the brain matter, the blood, and even some chunks of skull that came from that fatal shot, which you can see the line. He's almost directly in a straight line from where that red circle is to the president's uh, where the president's head is. Of course, the car has moved slightly since he was shot. So at the time of the shot, you could kind of see where they were all lined up. The red circle is where the president's head would have been, where the car would have been in relation to the officer on the motorcycle. And that's pretty compelling evidence that the fatal shot came from that location, because all the spray happened in the direction of that motorcycle cop. It didn't happen. If it came from behind, the spray would have been in the middle seat and the front seat of the limo, all over the front of the car, but it wasn't. It was over the rear of the car, the uh, the trunk, the windshield, the visor of the motorcycle cop. He also had to wipe off the visor of his helmet. Uh, Remember Jackie famously crawling up on top of the trunk, uh, partly to help Clint Hill, the Secret Service man who was running to catch up, get up on the car, partly to pick up chunks of her husband's skull, which is scattered all over the backside of that trunk. So I've always thought this photo here was pretty important. The other photo at the bottom shows people running in the direction of the grassy knoll, including police officers who are trained to be able to determine where shots are coming from. The one motorcycle cop has completely stopped his bike, gotten off, and he's preparing to run up to the grassy knoll behind the fence. But you see, that's the direction everybody's looking, and that's in real time. So I think that's a pretty compelling photograph as well. Anyway, I just wanted to present those. Let's talk about some of this evidence, and let's go back and touch on this ballistics evidence, because it's not as open and shut as you might think. It was in 64. Okay. Like we said, the Warren Commission handled their business just as quickly as possible. It was slam, bam, thank you, ma'am, and it's done. Right. Well, years later, the House Select Committee, you're talking about the late 70s, is reopening the investigation. So you're talking about 15 years later. And the same guy, Dr. Vincent Gwynn, who examined the ballistics evidence that the FBI gave him in 63 or 64, is going to be examining it again, but this time for the House Select Committee. And he actually challenges the ballistics evidence that he himself took part in producing the report in 64. Remember, the ballistics evidence that linked all the bullet fragments were found in the limo and the president's brain and Governor Connolly's wrist were all linked to Oswald's Manicure Carcano. So 15 years, and Dr. Vincent Gwynn signed off on that. Okay. He's the one that examined them in 64. And so he's doing it again. And this time he's testifying that the bullet fragments he was given by the FBI to test are not the same bullet fragments that were found in the limo, Governor Connolly's wrist, and or the president's brain. And his argument is they're too big. They're too big. You take that magic bullet, for example. This is where the planting of evidence actually works against you, because you planted a bullet that was in almost perfect condition, and there's just a tiny little dimple out the front of it. Otherwise, it's in perfect condition. If that is the magic bullet that caused 7 wounds in 2 people, a lot of the bullet, any fragments that they find in that pathway of that bullet, any bullet would have to come from that bullet. So that's going to be fragments possibly in the president's back, coming out his neck, certainly in Governor Connolly's armpit area or wrist, which they did find bullet fragments in his wrist. The bullet fragments in his wrist alone were too big. They weighed more than could have possibly come from that magic bullet, because the magic bullet, as I said, was in near perfect condition. So those bullet fragments could not have come from that magic bullet, is what he's saying. The particles that the FBI is giving Dr. Gwynn to study are too big to be the real particles. They would have to be tiny little microscopic particles to fit in that, whatever that little dimple is that's out of the front of the magic bullet. They're giving them particles that are too big. And he didn't even really have to test it. He just weighs them. He weighs the magic bullet. He weighs the particles. He knows the difference, what's missing from the magic bullet, and what they're giving him, the bullet fragments, are too heavy to have been from that magic bullet. I hope I explained that right. I hope you understand what I'm saying. There's just no way those bullet fragments could have come from that magic bullet. The magic bullet is in too good of condition. Now, his radiation tests confirm that they match each other, which means they all came from the same bullet, but it's not the magic bullet. And it's not the same pieces that he analyzed in 64. In other words, someone's pulled a switcheroo here. And he's caught it because he's the guy who did the original tests. I've included here his testimony, which he's the guy. It's going to be called to the House Select Committee to testify in 1977. So this is 13 years later. And the question is asked by Fithian to Dr. Gwynn. He says, now then, did you test exactly the same particles that the FBI tested in 64? And Gwynn says, well, it turns out I did not, for reasons I don't know. Because as they did the analysis, they did not destroy the samples either. Fithian says, so? Gwynn says, well, the particular little pieces that they analyzed, I could just as well have analyzed over again, but the pieces that were brought from the archives, which reportedly, according to Mr. Gear, were the only bullet lead fragments from this case still present in the archives, did not include any of the specific little pieces that the FBI had analyzed. Presumably, those are in existence somewhere. I am sure nobody threw them out, but where they are, I have no idea. So here we are with another case of evidence that has disappeared. For the purposes of the rush job of the Warren Commission, the evidence that was produced by the FBI, of course, all this is why I made such a point yesterday saying per FBI. All this evidence was being given to the Warren Commission by the FBI. It was being examined by the FBI. And Dr. Vincent Gwynn testified in front of the Warren Commission in 64 to that effect. But now he's being asked to examine these same bullet fragments again. What he's saying is these aren't the same fragments. This takes me back in my mind to the Tippit scene. And they say they found a wallet. And when asked to produce the wallet, we can't find the wallet. This takes me back to the Tippit scene when they say they found 4 shell casings and that their officer signed his initials to it. And then later, when they're looking at the exhibit from the Warren Commission of those same shell casings, they don't have the officer's initials on them. You know, in a criminal trial of any kind, chain of custody when it comes to evidence is extremely important. And if it's demonstrated to have that chain of custody to have been broken, that evidence is thrown out. It can't be used. It's assumed to be contaminated in some manner, shape, form. But here we have some pretty important evidence that has clearly been contaminated. It's missing. And they're substituting in its place different evidence and counting on the fact that Dr. Vincent Gwynn would not catch it, but he did. He caught it. So that's inconvenient. Another inconvenient matter is the fact that the bullet that took the president's head off was a frangible bullet, which means it explodes on contact. You can see in frame 313 what I'm talking about. But all the other bullets, including the magic bullet, that's a picture of CE 399 right there. You can see that little dimple at the end of it, right at the tip. But otherwise, the bullet's in perfect condition. So what the Warren Commission is asking us to believe, they're saying it was one shooter, used one gun, one shooter, one location. Well, why did he use a frangible bullet for the headshot, but all the other shots used a full metal jacket bullet? That doesn't make any sense. The same gun using different bullets. Uh, the same shooter with the same gun from the same location using different kinds of bullets. It's clear the frangible bullet, as you can see just by looking, and the fact that all that was remaining of that bullet was tiny little fragments in the president's brain. But then here you have this magic bullet that is nearly completely intact. That doesn't make sense. Okay. So again, now the ballistics evidence starting to look a little bit different when you present a little bit of a defense, which of course doesn't get presented originally, but it now is in 77. Then let's just consider some testimony, which is inconvenient as well. Julie Ann Mercer, now we've talked about her before. She told the Dallas Sheriff's Office on the day of the assassination and the FBI on the next day that the day before the assassination, November 21, while she was waiting for traffic in Dealey Plaza, she observed a white male in his late 20s or early 30s wearing a plaid shirt get out of a truck that was parked up on the curb, carrying a rifle up the grassy embankment toward the wooden fence there. And I told you the story. She gets up next to the guy in the truck, and she looks at him, and he looks at her, and she could identify him later. And after he shoots Lee Harvey Oswald, she identifies the man as Jack Ruby. This happened the day before Ruby shot Oswald. Okay, so this is the 22nd. I put the wrong date on there. This is the 22nd when this happens. This is the day of the actual assassination. This is at 11 o'clock on Friday morning. Okay, she's waiting to get through traffic. She thinks that it must be the Secret Service that's holding everything up, causing the traffic jam. And so she just sort of watches, and that guy gets out of the truck, pulls the rifle out of the back of the bed, and walks up the grassy knoll. And she gets up next to the truck, which is kind of parked on the curb, blocking traffic. She looks at Ruby. Ruby looks at her. 2 days later, well, that afternoon, the president is killed. And of course, we just showed pretty compelling evidence that the fatal shot came from that grassy knoll location. And then 2 days later, Oswald is killed, and the killer is identified on television. She looks at the screen, at the image, and she says, "Holy cow, it's the same guy." So she goes and she tells the story. And on November 22, she tells the story, and then the next day, the FBI has her come in, tells the story, and so it's. And then she finds out, and I'll show you here this next slide. In 1968, 5 years later, she's confronted with what she said to the Warren Commission, and she reads it for the first time, and she says, "These all have been altered. They have me saying just the opposite of what I really told them. He was only a few feet from me. How could I not recognize Jack Ruby when I saw him shoot Oswald on TV? See that notarized signature? That's not my signature." And here you have the Dallas Sheriff's Office and the FBI with their sworn affidavits that said Mercer could not identify Ruby. And here's Julie Ann Mercer saying, "I most certainly did identify Ruby. I saw him clearly and identified. And that's why I went and told my story, because I could identify. If I couldn't have identified him, I wouldn't have gone and told the story." So here we have evidence that has been changed. So if I'm a defense attorney, and I'm not an attorney, so I don't have any experience in this matter, but it seems to me that if I can show a pattern of evidence being substituted out, like the bullets, or changed, like in this case, it calls into question all the evidence. You start to wonder about the evidence itself, because it's clearly being tinkered with. It's being changed. In this case, it's literally her signature has been forged. And of course, remember when we started off, it's J. Edgar Hoover's FBI that's handling all this evidence. And he's already decided what happened. He's already made a statement to Bobby. He's already made a report that's gone public that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. It's his FBI that's in charge of all this evidence. Okay. And I think we're showing a pattern here. The Warren Commission wants us to believe all the bullets came from Mannlicher Carcano. And yet the ballistics evidence that they're giving us and from one location, from one shooter, but the ballistics evidence doesn't line up with that. Certainly doesn't line up when you consider one of the bullets was frangible and the others was full metal jacket. That doesn't make sense. That points to a second gun for sure. And then the location, here you have Julianne Mercer seeing one of the gunmen being dropped off at the grassy knoll location. So that calls into question if all the shots came from the Texas School Book Depository. William S. Walter was an FBI night clerk on duty of November 17th, 63 to 1976. Here again, 13 years later, Walter provides the Senate Intelligence Committee with a copy of the text of an FBI telex originally sent to all FBI field offices 5 days before the assassination. Now remember, Oswald was an FBI informant, and it was a man named Lee, an FBI informant named Lee, who sent a warning to the Chicago field office of the FBI about the Chicago plot to kill the president on November 2nd. And that FBI telex resulted in the White House canceling the trip. So his role as an FBI informant saved the president's life on November 2. Well, here he is 5 days before the Dallas trip, and the FBI receives another telex, another warning, and look what it says. Urgent. And this is sent at 1:45 a.m., which corroborates his story, which he was working overnight. And it's to all the sacks from the director, quote, threat to assassinate President Kennedy in Dallas, Texas, November 22. Bureau has determined that a militant revolutionary group, Alpha 66, may attempt to assassinate President Kennedy on his proposed trip to Dallas. And then it goes on from there. Here you can see a copy of it. It's been signed off. You can see, you sign it when you've seen it. So obviously, at least 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5 people saw that. Walter saw it, and he's testifying to it. So the question is, what happened to it? Well, Walter goes back after the assassination. He leaves his lunch, and he runs back to his New Orleans bureau office. So he's in New Orleans. He runs back to his office, retrieves the warning telex, and makes a copy. That's why he has this. He was smart enough to go back and make a copy of it. Days later, when he goes back to recheck the file to see the original, the warning telex was gone. And it just disappeared into thin air. So here we go, evidence being destroyed. All right, this would be pretty damning to the FBI if evidence came out 5 days prior. They were warned specifically about an assassination plot in Dallas on the day that the president was assassinated. It shows that they had advance notice. And I would submit it shows that there's somebody inside who's informing the FBI of all of these assassination plots. And the first time it succeeded, and the second time it didn't. Almost like they decided in advance, we can't let this ever see the light of day, or the White House will cancel the trip again, like they did in Chicago. In other words, in order for this to go through, this warning has to disappear, which is exactly what happened. And thankfully, Walter had the good sense to make a copy of it and testify to that. And now we have record of it. Okay, so then we have some more inconvenient eyewitness testimony. Abraham Zapruder, this again goes to the location of the fatal shot, which of course the Warren Commission is saying all came from one location, one gun, one shooter, Texas School Book Depository. Well, Abraham Zapruder, who was standing on that pergola, as you can see in the picture in the yellow, filming the famous footage, the Zapruder footage, testified to the Warren Commission, the shots came from right behind me. Well, he would be in a position to know. And he says JFK was ganged up on. And you notice he says shots, plural, came from right behind me. So this speaks to more than one shot coming from behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. Jackie, who obviously is riding in the car with her husband, says to the Warren Commission, his last expression was so neat. He had his hand out. I could see a piece of his skull coming off. It was flesh colored, not white. He was holding out his hand. I could see this perfectly clean piece detaching itself from his head. Then he slumped in my lap. Now, I included this quote because later I'm going to show you what the Warren Commission produces as an exhibit from the autopsy showing the president to have a completely intact head. Completely intact, small little bullet hole in the back, but otherwise completely intact. Jackie is saying here, I could see a piece of his skull coming off. It was flesh colored, not white. I can see this perfectly clean piece detaching itself from his head. All right, what I'm trying to show you here is that all of the evidence that the Warren Commission is submitting and putting in its exhibit, its Warren report, as evidence to prove its lone gunman theory, can be disputed. That autopsy photo, how do you reconcile that autopsy photo, which you haven't seen yet, but I'll show it to you, with what Jackie said happened? Jackie said a piece of the skull came off. Jackie said a clean piece detached itself from his head, and then he slumped in my lap. How do you reconcile that? Unless you show a pattern of other evidence being monkeyed with. The bullet fragments being produced are not the same bullet fragments that were produced in 64. The bullet fragments or shell casings from the Tippit scene are not the same bullet shell casings that the officer signed or initialed. The wallet disappears. And we're also showing compelling evidence testimony from people who are saying, no, the shots came from the grassy knoll right behind me, not the Texas School Book Depository. So one by one, you can dispute all of these evidence that the FBI has produced, which seemed, when we went over it yesterday, so ironclad, so open and shut. Nellie Connolly, governor's wife, said to the Warren Commission, it felt like I was being tattooed by hot hail, talking about JFK's brain matter. So that, again, corroborates what Jackie said. His head came apart, okay? The autopsy shows a completely intact head. Well, that wouldn't jive with what Jackie says and what Nellie says. Spray doesn't come from a completely intact head. Here again is that same motorcycle police officer, Officer Hargis, Bobby Hargis. The bullet hit him in the head, the one that killed him, and it seemed like his head exploded, and I was splattered with blood and brain. And you can see now I'm showing you the opposite direction. He's riding behind the limo to the left. You see the spray from the bullet hitting the president's head there, and it's clearly coming. The bullet is clearly coming from the direction of the grassy knoll for it to spray out over the back of the trunk of the limo and then spray onto Bobby Hargis, the visor of his helmet, and the glass on his motorcycle. So he says, I was splattered with blood and brain. So again, this goes to what the Warren Commission said. Here's his autopsy photo and his head is completely intact. Well, here's three pretty unimpeachable witnesses who said, no, his head was not completely intact. I don't know where you got that autopsy photo, but that's not what I saw. Kenny O'Donnell on the follow-up car. So you can see how close the follow-up car is. This is before they make any of the turns on Dealey Plaza, or the final turn. Actually, they've made the turn here. So I'm wrong there. They've made the turn onto Elm Street. This is right before the shooting starts. Kenny O'Donnell says the final shot took the side of his head off. It made a sickening sound like a grapefruit splattering against the side of a wall. Again, how do you reconcile that with what the Warren Commission says? O'Donnell and Dave Powers, both in the follow-up car, both told the FBI they heard at least 2 shots from the grassy knoll. Now, O'Donnell later changes his story. He was pressured when we get to the Secret Service as one of the conspirators. we'll talk about that story and how he was pressured to change his testimony, and he did. But Powers refused. He refused to change his testimony. And so the Warren Commission, after O'Donnell changes his story, invites O'Donnell to testify, but does not invite Powers to testify. So going back a couple episodes ago, the title or the question was, how do you rig an investigation? Well, this is another example of that. You just don't call people to testify that you know are going to testify counter to what the cover story says. You call the guy who's changed the story. But there again, they're testifying to, at least Powers is, the shots, at least two of them came from a different location, which means a second shooter. Joe Marshall Smith, a Dallas police officer, testified, quote, I heard the shots and thought they were coming from the bushes of the overpass. And then a little later, he says, a woman came up to me and told me they are shooting the president from the bushes. So I immediately proceeded up to the trees near the wooden fence on the grassy knoll and began searching the parking lot behind the wooden fence. And when I was there, quote, I caught the smell of gunpowder there. I could tell it was in the air. So Joe Marshall Smith, another Dallas police officer who would be I would consider to be an expert witness in a situation like this, ran up. A woman came. First of all, he had his own suspicions based on what he heard. And then a woman comes to him, so they're shooting him from the bushes, and she's pointing. So he runs up there. He puts his motorcycle down. He runs up there. And when he gets behind the wooden fence on the grassy knoll, he can smell gunpowder. Ralph Yarborough, the Texas senator in the motorcade a couple cars back, says, as the motorcade finally proceeded through the grassy knoll area, quote, you could smell gunpowder as we approached the overpass. That's as we were passing the grassy knoll area. So again, more evidence that the shots weren't from one location. Lee Bowers, who was in the railroad tower, he was the switchman for the railroad, testified that a few minutes before the shooting, he saw two men he didn't recognize standing behind the picket fence on the knoll, and they were standing there watching the motorcade. This is a copy of his written statement there. This is that picture that you see at the bottom is what the view that he had from this railroad tower. You see it's all surrounded by glass, and so he's directly behind the grassy knoll area in the park. You can see the whole parking area. He can see behind that picket fence. He also testified that earlier he'd seen an unfamiliar man driving a car around the railroad yard behind the knoll. The man was speaking into a handheld microphone. Okay, so clearly this testimony that I'm presenting here, this evidence from these witnesses, speaks to something going on the grassy knoll. The presence of gunpowder smoke, the presence of two men behind the grassy knoll, the picket fence, the presence of unfamiliar, and of course, Lee Bowers was in a position, he'd worked there for years. He knew pretty much every car that was parked back there and why it was parked there, who it belonged to. He was there every day. And so he would be in a position to know if someone was unfamiliar driving around in that parking area, talking into what looked like a radio, a handheld microphone. And he would be able, that would stand out in his mind. Okay. So clearly something's going on out of the ordinary on the grassy knoll. How about J.C. Price, who was a Dallas roofing worker, testified that after he heard the shots, he saw one man run towards the passenger cars of the railroad siding with something in his hand. So, he's I don't know where Price was standing. Oh, here it is. You see that picture there? You can see he's standing on the overpass, and this is his sworn statement, Mr. J.C. Price. And he's saying, as I was standing on this overpass, after the shots, I saw a man run towards the passenger car. So we just saw the parking area. So he's running towards the cars in the parking lot, and he has something in his hand. And of course, Lee Bowers has said he saw a guy driving around back there with a radio, talking into a radio, just kind of driving around in circles. So it makes it sound like the shooter or the spotter or somebody ran towards that car. It was waiting for him, and off they took, and he had something in his hand after the shooting. S.M. Holland, who was a signal operator for the railroad, said, quote, I heard a third report. I counted 4 shots. And in this group of trees, there was a shot, a report, and a puff of smoke came out about 6 or 8 feet above the ground, right out from under those trees. I have no doubt about seeing that puff of smoke come out from under those trees. I definitely saw the puff of smoke and heard the report from under those trees. I'm going to go back one photo because I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but you see an arrow at on the bottom picture, you see a white arrow. And that is an arrow to the location where he said he saw the flash, the smoke, and then later, 2 sets of fresh footprints were found there. This is behind the picket fence. So this is right smack in front of Lee Bowers. Lee Bowers would be seeing this. And of course, S.M. Holland, who was a signal operator for the railroad and would be in that same um, location that Lee Bowers was in, saw this puff of smoke. And he testifies to that. He repeats himself like 3 different times. I promise I saw that. I'm sure I saw it. O.V. Campbell, who was the president of the Texas School Book Depository, testified that the shooting came from the grassy area down this way. He's pointing to the grassy knoll. I heard shots being fired from a point I thought was near the railroad tracks. All right, this is O.V. Campbell's written statement on the right. He's the president of the Texas School Book Depository. He's testifying that the shots came from the grassy knoll. James Tague was a Dallas car salesman there to watch the motorcade. You see a picture of him, a red circle down there, and that's where he's standing. And my first impression, he says, was that up by the whatever you call the monument or whatever it was, that somebody was throwing firecrackers up there, and the police were running up to it. So what he sees as he's looking back towards the grassy knoll is that all the action is happening at the top of the grassy knoll in the area of that fenced in area. Of course, James Tague becomes a real problem for the Warren Commission because he got nicked with a bullet, and that becomes one of the bullets. And of course, the other bullet everybody saw take the president's head off, so that's 2. That only leaves 1 bullet if it's 1 shooter. That's why they had to make up the magic bullet theory, that 1 bullet created 7 wounds in 2 people. They didn't have 4 shots is 2 people. You can't have a 4th shot. So they had to make the magic bullet do all the zigging and zagging and up and down and all creating all those wounds, because they're already accounting for 2 of the other bullets are already accounted for. The one that missed and hit James Tague, the one that hit the president's head, the 3rd bullet has to create all the wounds. So James Tague is a problem from start to finish as far as the cover story is concerned. Billy Lovelady, who is pictured here in the doorway of the Texas School Book Depository. Some people thought that was Oswald. It looks kind of like him, but that was Billy Lovelady. And he testified that shots came right there around that concrete little deal on that knoll. So he's standing on the steps of the Texas School Book Depository when the shots happen. He's looking out at Elm Street at the motorcade, and from his peripheral vision in his right eye, he said the shots came from right there. So he was in a position. So you have the grassy knoll area kind of covered from different angles. James Tague is looking back at it from across the street. Billy Lovelady is looking sort of out of the right corner of his eye at it on the same side of the street. You have the Zapruder standing on the grassy knoll, and the bullets are literally coming from behind him. He says bullets, plural. You have railroad workers behind the grassy knoll area seeing puffs of smoke behind the fence. You have the police officer putting down his bike and running up there and smelling gunpowder behind the grassy knoll. They find fresh footprints behind the grassy knoll, behind the picket fence. William Newman, pictured famously, he and his wife and child hit the deck. They were on the grassy knoll out near the sidewalk and the curb. He's there with his family to watch the motorcade. He says, quote, we were standing on the edge of the curb looking at the car as it was coming towards us. He was directly in front of us. I was looking directly at him when he was hit in the side of the head. Then we fell down on the grass as it seemed that we were in the direct path of fire. I thought the shot had come from the garden directly behind me. I looked back in the vicinity of the garden. You can see where he's looking back. Okay, and of course that's a mock up there for the movie that came out later. But this is, if you look at photos taken at that instant, there's the Newman family flat on their, laying on the grass, looking back at the grassy knoll area. And of course, they're on the grassy knoll, but they're looking back at the what he called the garden area. Malcolm Summers, owner of a local mailing service, testified when he heard the shooting, when the shooting ended, quote, all of the people started running up the terrace. Everybody was just running around toward the railroad tracks, and I knew that they had someone trapped up there. So you see where he's sitting. He's on the opposite side of Elm Street, looking back towards the grassy knoll, right? The shooting has just happened. He's still just kind of not even reacting to it yet. It's just happened. You see Jackie is getting up out of the seat. Clint Hill, you can see in the bottom left hand, is running towards the car. She's about ready to reach out to help him with one hand, pick up chunks of her husband's skull with the other. Her husband is literally laying, he has fallen into her, and you can see the big gaping white area there. That's the head wound. You can see half his head is missing. And Malcolm Summers, who is sitting there looking at all this, is looking directly at the grassy knoll area, and says that that's where everybody started running. Everybody's running up towards the grassy knoll. And he said, I thought they got the guy. I thought they trapped him up there. So what I'm trying to do here is show a pattern of a lot of witnesses who in 77 are going to come out and dispute what the Warren Commission said was an open and shut case. All the shots came from Texas School Book Depository. Richard Randolph Carr testified he heard, quote, heard shots from the grassy knoll and saw a furrow caused by a bullet that missed the president's limo, cutting a path eastward through the grass in Dealey Plaza. Uh-oh, that's another bullet. Okay, so we have two witnesses now that say multiple bullets came from the grassy knoll area. The one that hit the president, and now we have testimony of one that missed and went through the grass and left a furrow. So, of course, we know that the House Select Committee is going to determine, they're going to say 4 shots. And so, as soon as you get to 4, it's no longer one shooter. According to Carr, when he told his story to the FBI, the agent told him, if you didn't see Lee Harvey Oswald in the school book depository with a rifle, you didn't see it. My goodness. So here is definitive proof that the FBI is monkeying with the evidence to produce a desired outcome, which is that one shooter took all the shots with the Mannlicher Carcano from one location, and it's open and shut. That's it. And so what I've just shown you is what any half competent defense attorney would be able to present in the event of a trial that disputes every bit of evidence that J. Edgar Hoover's FBI has produced that seems so convincing. It's not convincing. The ballistics evidence is in doubt. Because of the testimony of Dr. Vincent Gwynn, these are not the same bullet fragments. Chain of custody has been interrupted for sure, at the very minimum. These shell casings from the Tippit scene are not the same. And this affidavit from Julia Ann Mercer has been changed per her testimony. She saw Ruby dropping off the gunman that morning at the grassy knoll. And then I've got all these witnesses who say the shooting came from the grassy knoll behind the picket fence, did not come from the Texas School Book Depository. This is not to say that they know who the shooter is behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll. This is just to say there was a shooter there. There was gunpowder, there were footprints, there were suspicious people driving around, suspicious people hanging around behind the picket fence. Lee Bowers would testify to that. There was smoke from shots that several people in the railroad bridge saw. You could smell gunpowder. Several people smelled it. People could see, based on just the physical evidence of how the president's head reacted to the shot and where all the spray went, it points to bullets coming from the grassy knoll. I mean, It's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. And it makes you wonder, what the Warren Commission received in the way of evidence. These are grown men. These are thinking, smart, intelligent people. How do you dispute this? How do you reconcile one location, one shooter with all this evidence? Well, the way you rigged the investigation, you find out, we've already seen that if you didn't, with the case of the two Secret Service agents, or the two people in the follow-up car, one changed his story because he was pressured by the Secret Service to change his story. That's the guy who got called to testify at the Warren Commission. Powers didn't change his story. He said, I know there were two shots that came. I heard two shots come from the grassy knoll area. He didn't get called to testify. So that's how you rig this whole thing. You call the people you cherry pick your witnesses, and you find out in advance who's going to testify to what, whose testimony can be changed, whose can't. And the people that can be changed, you call them. The people who testify the way you want them to, you call them. And the other people, you don't. Oh, and then when you have a situation that you can't change, or you can't withhold, like Julie Ann Mercer, you just change her affidavit. You change what she wrote, her written testimony, and you forge her signature. And then you classify everything so that nobody can go back and check it. And the first time somebody checks it is years later, when they get a hold of the classified document and they start comparing what she said to what is written. And my goodness. And believe me, we've just gotten started. I can't wait to get into the autopsy photo, because that's why I included those statements by Jackie and Mrs. Connolly, and the Dallas police officer, Bobby Hargis, because they clearly say that the president's head came apart. Chunks of it were, there was hot spray, brain matter everywhere. And yet when you see the autopsy photo, that's either A, it's not the president's head, or B, that autopsy photo has been doctored with, or the president's head has been doctored. Something's happened to change what Jackie saw, what Nellie Connolly saw, and what Bobby Hargis saw. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, I assure you. But the question today was there any evidence that contradicted the cover story? Here's just a little sampling of some evidence that contradicts, what's the cover story? The cover story is that all the shots came from one location. Well, I just gave you multiple witness testimonies that said, no, the shots came from the grassy knoll. So what's the cover story? All the shots came from one gun. Well, I just gave you evidence that there was a frangible bullet and the other bullets were full metal jacket. That speaks to two guns, right? So that contradicts the cover story. What else does the cover story say? One shooter, all right? Well, if you have shots from two locations, you have two shooters, unless the shooter is just unbelievably fast and he runs from, that's ridiculous. But you have two shooters, okay? And what's the cover story? 3 shots. Well, we know Hargis we know James Tay got nicked with a bullet standing right there at the base of the railroad. That's 1. We know the president's head got blown off. That's 2. We know that at least, all right, let's just stipulate there was a magic bullet. That's the 3rd shot, right? Well, according to one of the testimony, there was a shot that missed the president and went through the grass, heading east through the grass, and left a furrow. That's 4. Okay. Now I don't believe that there's such a thing as a magic bullet, but I think there were, and even Connolly said he maintained till the day he died that the shot that hit him was not the same shot that hit the president. He was adamant about that. So now you're up to 5 shots. Okay, you see, so the cover story is being blown to bits, and we're just getting started. The fact that the Warren Commission is going to present the president's autopsy photo with a tiny little bullet hole in the back of his head to say that that was the fatal shot, that's going to be blown apart by the testimony of Jackie and Nellie and Bobby Hargis. So my point is, there's a lot of evidence to contradict the cover story. And that's why you can't have a trial, because the defense is going to bring all these witnesses up on to the stand, and the jury's gonna be sitting there going, huh, boy, it seems so open and shut a minute ago when we were just listening to the prosecution, but now it doesn't seem that way. And seems like the FBI has a dog in this fight, that they're excluding certain witnesses. I mean, that's what Carr says here. Randolph Carr says, if you didn't see, the agent told him this. Okay, he's trying to give his testimony. The agent tells him, listen, if you didn't see Oswald in the school book depository with the rifle, you didn't see it. That's the FBI. The word has gone out. Remember, the assistant attorney general, within hours of the suspect being arrested, Lee Harvey Oswald, the American people must be satisfied that Lee Harvey Oswald was the gunman, that he acted alone and does not have Confederates out there who are still at large, and that he would be convicted at trial. The word has gone out from J. Edgar Hoover, from the assistant attorney general. You say, well, why not the attorney general? Well, if you remember, the attorney general was Bobby Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy has already been told by J. Edgar Hoover, Oswald acted alone, and Bobby knows he's full, you know what, which is why he immediately calls the CIA. Bobby knows that ain't true. So it's the assistant attorney general who steps in. The word has come down from on high, and everybody got the message. And so here is Richard Randolph Carr telling the FBI what he saw, and he is being told by the FBI agent, you didn't see what you think you saw. Unless you see Oswald in the Texas school book depository with the rifle, you didn't see it. I mean, my goodness, can you imagine having a trial and Richard Randolph Carr taking the witness stand and saying what the FBI agent told him? I mean, if I'm in that jury, I don't believe another word I hear from the FBI. Anybody they put on that stand who has credentials from the FBI and is testifying as some sort of expert, I'm just assuming they're lying, because they have already made up their mind and they are cherry picking the evidence and the witnesses to fit the cover story that they've already determined in advance. It's all been predetermined. And this is how you rig something. And because it's not a trial, you can't cross-examine, you can't present a defense. All you take is what the FBI gave to the Warren Commission, and the Warren Commission has dutifully reported on it and rubber stamped whatever J. Edgar Hoover sent them. And then produced this 888-page book of fiction that is supposed to be the gospel. The American people just sopped it up, the media, and became fodder for the textbooks and the movies and the books, and it became the legend. And now we're finding out in the late 60s, we start to get little dribs and drabs because Jim Garrison pokes some holes. And then we get to the House Select Committee in the late 70s, and the evidence starts pouring out from these witnesses. And you see just how contaminated, how corrupted, how compromised the Warren Commission was from the get-go. Okay. I better stop there. I get kind of fired up about this. Check out my website, sphistory.com or barryljones.com. Feel free to subscribe to the channel. It's free. Hit the thumbs up, hit the notification bell. We will continue on. This is episode 40, I believe. So tomorrow, which is Saturday, I'll do one from home, and we'll continue on with some more inconvenient evidence that's just pouring out. It's interesting, the evidence that supports the lone gunman isn't a lot. Now, it seems overwhelming when that's all you hear, but pretty quickly it gets destroyed. And then the evidence to support that contradicts the lone gunman is a lot. It's a lot. And so it takes me several days to get through the evidence that contradicts. But anyway, we'll continue on with that tomorrow. Appreciate all your comments. Like I said, I'm learning from you guys. That comment about the field of fire, I had never thought about that, and how they wait to take the shots, and they had people that were helping them on the ground keep clear fields of fire for their shooting teams, especially the ones on the ground. And you can really see it in those photos at the beginning of today's episode. And there were several other really good comments yesterday that opened my eyes to some things. So keep them coming. Appreciate all you guys. We'll talk again tomorrow. Until then, everybody have a great day. Thank you.